The glass hit the floor before anyone moved. I heard it shatter, and then I heard something worse. Silence. The kind that comes after a name nobody expected to hear. Marcus Webb had said only 2 words. 2 words, and the man who'd spent the last hour explaining why I owed this family something was standing with his mouth open, not finishing his sentence. Not surprised pale. Haunted pale. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. The specific kind of tired that lives behind your sternum and never quite goes away. Before we go back to that night, drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. I always want to know who's out there listening. Now let me take you back to where this really started. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I was sitting at my kitchen table with the invitation, if you could call it that, still folded in thirds, the way it had arrived, crease marks sharp enough to cut. Gerald Washington's handwriting on the envelope. Not a card, not a letter. A single index card with an address, a time, and 4 words. We need to talk. No, please. No, I'm sorry. No acknowledgement that 6 years had passed since we'd said anything real to each other, and even then what we'd said hadn't been much. I made coffee I didn't drink. I stood at the window and watched a neighbor's dog drag a stick twice its size across the yard, completely committed to something that made no logical sense. I understood that dog. I was 42 years old. I had survived things I am not permitted to describe in detail, and things I simply choose not to. I had held a tourniquet on a man's leg in water up to my chest and talked to him about his daughter's soccer game so he wouldn't go into shock. I had made decisions in fractions of seconds that I would spend years turning over in the back of my mind at 3 a.m. I had earned a call sign, and I had earned the silence that came with it. And I was standing in my kitchen, afraid to go to my father's house. Not afraid of him. That's important. I was never afraid of Gerald Washington. He was not a violent man, not a cruel man in the way that leaves marks you can point to. He was something harder to explain and harder to forgive. He was simply absent. Present in the house and absent from the room. There for dinners and gone for everything that mattered. He forgot my high school graduation because of a job site emergency. He missed my commissioning because he had a golf trip already booked. He didn't know I'd joined the Navy until 3 months after I'd shipped out, when my aunt called him and told him herself. He found out what I did, what I really did, never. As far as Gerald Washington knew, his daughter worked for the government. Processing something. Logistics, maybe. He'd stopped asking questions somewhere around the time he stopped asking questions about anything to do with me. My mother would have known. My mother tracked everything. She kept a calendar on the refrigerator with color-coded markers, blue for school events, red for doctor appointments, green for what she called the good stuff, which was everything else. Birthdays, recitals, the day I lost my first tooth, the day I won my first race. The refrigerator was covered in green. She died when I was 14. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless, 9 months from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand on a Tuesday afternoon in March, while my father sat in a chair by the window looking at something outside that I couldn't see and have never stopped wondering about. He married Diane 16 months later. I don't say that to condemn him. Grief does strange things. Loneliness does stranger things. But I was 15 years old, and I watched my father choose to build a new life with a focus and an energy he had never once directed at the life we already had, and something in me made a quiet, permanent decision. I would not need him. It is a decision that feels like strength when you're young, and feels like something more complicated when you're older. I joined the Navy at 18, partly because I believed in service, and partly because it was the furthest I could get from a house that no longer felt like mine. I pushed through programs that broke people who were stronger than me physically because I had something they didn't, which was the specific motivation of a girl who had learned early that no one was coming to save her, and she'd better figure out how to save herself. I was good at it. I was better than good. I don't say that with pride exactly. Pride requires an audience. I say it the way you'd note a fact about the weather. It was cold, it was true. The government job line wasn't a lie technically. I did work for the government. I just didn't elaborate. People hear government logistics coordinator, and they picture cubicles and filing systems and someone who knows which form to submit when. They don't picture what I actually do. I found it's easier not to correct them. The people who need to know already know, and everyone else doesn't need to. Gerald didn't need to know. That was what I'd decided. And I'd been comfortable with that decision for years, right up until that index card showed up in my mailbox, and I found myself standing at my kitchen window watching a dog with a stick and trying to remember the last time anyone in my family had seen me clearly. The thing about growing up invisible in your own home is that you get very good at watching. You learn to read rooms the way some people read books, quickly, instinctively looking for what's between the lines. You notice who's tense and why. You notice who's performing and for whom. You notice exits, which is a habit that started as a coping mechanism and became something more professionally useful later. I would go to that dinner. I knew I would go. I'd known it the moment I saw the handwriting on the envelope, because the truth, the one I'd spent years not looking at directly, was that Gerald Washington was still my father, and there was a part of me that had never stopped being the 15-year-old girl at the window wondering what he was looking at. I just wasn't going to let him know that. I poured the cold coffee down the sink. I changed into clean clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray pullover. Nothing that announced anything. I checked my phone out of habit the way you check before an operation, making sure everything is where it should be. Then I picked up my keys and I went. The drive was 40 minutes. I spent most of it not thinking about what I was driving toward and thinking instead about a river in a country I can't name and a man named Petty Officer Damian Cole and what he'd said to me the last time I'd seen him standing upright. I didn't know yet what that memory had to do with this dinner. I would. The house was bigger than I remembered, not because it had changed, it hadn't. Same brick facade, same black shutters, same driveway with the subtle upward slope that made you lean forward slightly when you walked it. It had been big when I was young too, but when you're a child, big means safe, means solid, means there is enough room for everyone and everything will be fine. When you're an adult looking at a house that was never really yours, big just means a lot of space for silence to live in. There were 4 cars in the driveway. I recognized Gerald's truck and Diane's silver sedan. The other 2 I didn't know. I sat in my car for 90 seconds, not hesitating, just observing the way you do before you enter any space where you don't fully control the variables. Then I got out. Diane answered the door before I knocked. She'd been watching for me, which told me something. She was wearing a cream blouse and the kind of careful smile that takes practice, warm enough to be polite, controlled enough to remind you who was hosting. She had aged well the way women who spend money on aging well tend to. Her hair was lighter than I remembered, and her jewelry was new. Sabrina. She said my name like a period, not a greeting. So glad you could make it. Diane. I said hers the same way. She stepped back to let me in, and I crossed the threshold into the house where my father had built his second life, and the smell hit me first the way smells always do. Something roasting in the oven, a candle burning somewhere, and underneath it all the faint ghost of a house that used to be different. Wood polish and old carpet. Some things don't change no matter how much new furniture you bring in. The living room had been rearranged. Of course it had. Nothing from before remained in its original position. There was a long dining table set for 7 candles-lit cloth napkins folded into shapes that required effort. Diane had wanted this to look like a dinner, like something normal, like a family that gathered regularly and enjoyed each other's company and didn't have 6 years of silence sitting at the table with them. Gerald was standing by the fireplace. He was older. I'd known he would be 6 years is 6 years, but knowing and seeing are different things. He was 71 and looked it now in a way he hadn't the last time I'd seen him. His hair had gone fully white. He was still tall, but carrying it differently the way men do when something structural has shifted. He was holding a glass of something amber, and he was watching me the way you watch something you're not sure is real. "Sabrina." His voice was the same. That was the disorienting part. Everything else had shifted, but his voice was exactly as I'd stored it. "Dad." One word. I gave him one word and watched what it did to his face, which was complicated and fast and gone before I could fully read it. Tyler was on the couch. He stood when I came in. Someone had taught him that much at least, and extended a hand like we were colleagues meeting for the first time, which in most ways that counted we were. He was 28, broad-shouldered with Gerald's jaw and Diane's eyes and the particular ease of someone who had grown up knowing the floor would hold. "Hey," he said. "Good you came." I shook his hand, said nothing. The other person in the room was sitting in a chair near the window, an old wingback that had been there since before Diane, one of the few pieces of furniture I actually recognized. He was older than Gerald considerably, thin in the way of men who had once been something else entirely, with hands that sat on the armrests like they were used to stillness but remembered motion. He was watching me the way I'd been watching everyone else. I recognized what I was looking at. Not him specifically, I didn't know him, but I recognized the quality of his attention, the calibration of it. There are people who look at a room and see furniture and people and ambient light. And then there are people who look at a room and take inventory. He was the second kind. "Marcus Webb," Gerald said, gesturing. "Old friend. Navy man back in the day." Marcus Webb gave me a nod that was small and specific. Not a greeting nod, an acknowledgement nod. There is a difference, and I registered it without showing that I had. "Sabrina," Gerald said again. There was a pause in which he might have said something else, something that started with "I'm sorry," or "I should have," or "I didn't know how to," but instead he said, "Why don't we sit down?" So we sat. Dinner proceeded the way these things do when everyone at the table is pretending the table isn't on fire. Diane served things that required effort. Gerald asked me questions about my work in the vague way of someone who knows he doesn't know what to ask. Tyler talked about a real estate deal he was working on, something about a mixed-use development downtown, and I heard the word federal contracts and filed it without reacting. The lawyer arrived late. His name was Patterson, late 50s gray suit, the permanently tired expression of a man paid to manage other people's emergencies. He shook my hand with both of his, which is the handshake of someone who wants something, and said it was so good to finally meet me. He'd heard so much. I smiled in a way that didn't reach my eyes and said the same. It was during the salad course that Diane said it. She was refilling water glasses, moving around the table with the practiced efficiency of a woman who controlled her environment by managing its details, and she paused behind my chair and said lightly conversationally, the way you'd comment on the weather, "Sabrina's always been the quiet one, the independent one. Didn't really need family the way the rest of us do." She was smiling when she said it. Everyone at the table was looking somewhere else. I put down my fork. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip, and I said nothing. Because I had learned in conditions that would have unmade most people that the most powerful response to a provocation is often the absence of one. That silence properly deployed is not weakness, it is patience, and patience is just discipline applied to time. But Marcus Webb looked up from his plate when I said nothing, and something in his expression shifted. He was watching me the way you watch something you've been trying to place and you're getting close. The main course arrived and the temperature in the room dropped without anyone touching a thermostat. Diane had made pot roast, the kind that takes all day, that fills a house with a smell designed to communicate warmth and effort, and this is a family that cares. She set it on the table with the quiet satisfaction of someone placing a final piece in a strategic position, and for a moment everyone focused on the serving dishes and the passing of things and the small choreography of a meal, and it was almost possible to forget what we were actually here for. Almost. Gerald cleared his throat. He did it the way men do when they've rehearsed something and the moment has arrived and the rehearsal suddenly feels inadequate. He set down his fork. He looked at me. "I imagine you know this isn't just a social dinner," he said. I looked at him steadily. "I know. Patterson has been working with us on the federal contract issue. There's been some scrutiny from the agency, and we thought given your position you might be able to..." He paused, searched for the word. "Facilitate." Facilitate. A word chosen carefully to mean everything and commit to nothing. "What kind of scrutiny?" I said. Not a question, a prompt. Patterson set down his own fork and smoothed his tie, which did not need smoothing. "There's an ongoing review of certain subcontracting arrangements related to a naval installation project from 2021 and 2022. The scope is it's broad, and there are aspects that have been characterized in ways that don't reflect the full picture. We believe a conversation with the right people at the agency could..." "Which installation?" I said. Silence. Patterson looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at his plate. Diane looked at Patterson. "Naval Air Station Fallon," Patterson said finally. "Nevada." I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of the pot roast. I put it in my mouth and chewed slowly and swallowed, and I kept my face exactly where I wanted it, which was nowhere, which was the look of a woman processing routine information at a routine dinner. Inside, something went very still. Naval Air Station Fallon. I knew that installation. I knew it the way you know the coordinates of a place you've had to think about at 3 a.m, turning details over and over because what happened there didn't resolve cleanly, and some things don't. 2021. That was the year Damian Cole came home with a different gait and a titanium rod in his left femur after a maintenance platform collapse in a facility that was supposed to have been inspected and cleared. I had not known until this moment who had built that platform. I knew now. Tyler was the one who broke the silence, because Tyler was always the one who broke silences in the direction of making things worse. He leaned back in his chair with the specific body language of a young man who has never had a reason to make himself small. And he looked at me the way people look at tools. They're trying to assess for usefulness. "I mean, you work with federal agencies every day, right?" he said. "Contracts, logistics, that kind of thing. You know people. That's literally your job." I said. "So it seems like it'd be pretty straightforward. A phone call, maybe a meeting. You explain the context, they understand. This has been mischaracterized, everyone moves on." He shrugged. One shoulder. The shrug of a man who believed that problems had simple solutions because he had never encountered a problem that didn't get solved by someone else. "It's not like we're asking you to do anything wrong. Just use your connections." I looked at him for a moment. He held my gaze with the confidence of someone who doesn't know what he's looking at. "Tell me about the subcontracting arrangements," I said. Tyler blinked. "That's Patterson should probably explain the... I'm asking you." Another blink. Slower. "I mean, I wasn't personally involved in the procurement side. That was Dad and Craig. I'm more on the development." "Craig Mercer," I said. The name did something to the air in the room. Gerald's hand moved not much, just a small tightening around his glass. Diane's expression did something careful and controlled. Patterson's eyes moved to Gerald with the speed of a man doing rapid damage assessment. "Craig's a partner," Gerald said. "He handled most of the subcontracting logistics on the federal projects." "Is he here tonight?" "No. Craig is dealing with some personal matters." I nodded slowly. Filed that. Craig Mercer was not at the table where they were asking me to make problems go away. That told me most of what I needed to know about how the weight of this had been distributed. Diane, sensing a shift in the room's balance that she hadn't authorized, leaned forward with a smile calibrated to redirect. "Sabrina, we're not trying to put you in an uncomfortable position. We're family. We just thought, given your unique access..." "She literally works a desk job." Tyler again. Impatient now because the conversation wasn't resolving the way simple conversations were supposed to. What would she even know about federal contracts and criminal investigations? No offense, but Patterson has been doing this for 30 years, and even he's saying we need someone on the inside. So either you can help or you can't. Which is it? The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of before. This was a different texture entirely, the kind of quiet that has weight and direction. Marcus Webb put down his fork. He had been silent through the entire meal. He had eaten carefully the way men eat when they're somewhere out of habit, and not because they're hungry. He had watched. He had listened. He had said nothing beyond the minimal requirements of politeness. But now he put down his fork with a small, precise click against the china, and he turned in his chair, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has just finished confirming something he suspected from the beginning. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quiet. The specific quiet of authority that doesn't need volume. He addressed the table, but his eyes were on me. "I want to ask our guest something, if that's all right." Gerald frowned. "Marcus, we're in the middle of..." "What branch?" Marcus said, still looking at me. "Not did you serve. Not are you military. Not any of the preambles that civilians use when they're guessing. Just what branch?" The shorthand of someone who already knows the answer is yes, and is triangulating everything else. The table didn't understand what had just happened. I could see it, Gerald's mild confusion, Diane's slight frown, Tyler's impatience. They thought it was a non sequitur, an old man going sideways in a conversation the way old men sometimes did. They didn't know that the air had just changed. I looked at Marcus Webb across the table. 78-years-old Navy man back in the day. Hands that remembered motion. Eyes that took inventory. A man who had looked at me from the moment I walked in the door and been quietly, methodically placing something. I gave him the one thing he'd earned. "Navy," I said. His eyes didn't change, but something in them settled the way a lock settles when the right key turns. "Rate," he said. One word. And in that one word was an entire conversation, a recognition, an invitation. A door opened a precise inch to see if I would walk through it. The table was still confused. Tyler had opened his mouth to say something impatient. I said the word before he could. "Special warfare, combatant craft crewman," I said. "Support operator, Naval Special Warfare Command." The words landed the way I knew they would land, which is to say, most people at the table heard them and understood nothing, And one person at the table heard them and understood everything. Tyler's mouth was still open. Diane had tilted her head slightly the way people do when they've heard a language they don't speak. Gerald was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Patterson had gone very still, in the specific way of lawyers who have just realized a room has changed in a direction they did not prepare for. Marcus Webb closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, something had shifted in his posture. Not dramatically. He didn't straighten the way people do in movies when a general walks into the room. It was smaller than that and more true, a realignment, the body's quiet acknowledgement of something the mind had just confirmed. "Unit," he said. "I can't tell you that." He nodded once, slowly, as if I had answered the question by not answering it. "Call sign," he said. The table had gone the kind of silent that happens when people sense something is occurring that they don't have the vocabulary for. Tyler had closed his mouth. Diane was watching Marcus with a frown she hadn't decided what to do with yet. Gerald had put down his glass. I looked at Marcus Webb for a long moment. I thought about the 40-minute drive. I thought about the index card with 4 words and no apology. I thought about a house that had stopped being mine at 15, and a calendar covered in green markers, and a woman who had tracked the good stuff in color-coded ink and had been gone for 27 years. I thought about Damien Cole's gate and a maintenance platform at Naval Air Station Fallon, and the name Craig Mercer sitting in the room like an uninvited guest. I thought about how long I had been making myself small so that other people could stay comfortable. "Anchor," I said. Marcus Webb stood up. Not fast, not dramatic. He placed both palms flat on the table, and he pushed himself to his feet with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has stood at attention more times than he could count, and whose body still knew the motion in its bones. He was 78 years old, and he stood like something that had been built to last. "Son," he said to Tyler. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man delivering a correction that should have been delivered a long time ago by someone else, and he was doing it without pleasure. "You want to sit back down and be quiet for a minute." Tyler stared at him. "What I was just—" "Sit down." Tyler sat down. Gerald said, "Marcus, what is—" "Gerald." Marcus turned to look at his old friend, and there was something in his expression that was both gentle and without compromise, the look of a man who has loved someone for a long time and is about to say something they won't want to hear. "Do you know what SWCC is?" Gerald shook his head slowly. "Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman. Naval Special Warfare Command." Marcus paused. "Let that land." "These are the operators who run the boats that insert and extract Navy SEALs from hostile environments. They work in darkness in enemy waters under fire. They are not logistics coordinators. They are not desk workers. They are—" He stopped, looked at me. "How many deployments?" 7. I said. He closed his eyes again, briefly. 7 deployments. He said it to the table like he was reading from a document. "And the call sign anchor doesn't get issued to someone who processes paperwork. That call sign means something specific to people who know what it means. It means the person wearing it was the fixed point, the one everything else relied on when everything else was coming apart." The room had gone completely still. Diane had set down her fork at some point without appearing to notice she'd done it. Tyler was looking at the table. Patterson was looking at me with an expression that had traveled a significant distance from where it started. Gerald was looking at me the way he had looked at something outside a hospital window 27 years ago, like he was trying to understand something just out of reach and wasn't sure he was capable of getting there. "She's your daughter," Marcus said to Gerald. His voice had gone softer. And you brought her here tonight to ask her to make a phone call. Gerald said nothing. You told me she worked for the government, Marcus said. You said she was in logistics. You said... He stopped himself, pressed his lips together. How long have you known her? How long has she been your daughter? Marcus, 42 years, Gerald. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 42 years, and you don't know what your daughter does. You don't know what she's done. You don't know what it cost her to walk through that door tonight after 6 years of silence because you needed a favor. He shook his head once slowly with the weariness of a man who has seen waste before and never gotten used to it. That's not how this should have gone. The candles were still burning. The pot roast was still on the table. Everything that had been carefully arranged to look like a normal family dinner was still in its place, and none of it meant anything it had meant 20 minutes ago. Tyler looked up from the table. When he spoke, the impatience was gone, replaced by something younger and less certain. So, you're like special forces. I looked at my brother. 28 years old, grown up in this house, handed things I had learned to take by force. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate someone for the circumstances of their softness. But I felt looking at him the full accumulated weight of what it had meant to be the other kind. I'm the person, I said quietly, that your father called when he needed someone to make his problem go away, which tells you something about what he thinks I'm capable of, even if he doesn't know why he thinks it. Gerald made a sound, low and fractured. Not a word, just a sound. I turned to look at him. He was a 71-year-old man sitting at a table he'd built in a house he'd built with a life he'd built on top of the rubble of the one we'd had before, and he was looking at me like he was seeing something for the first time that had been standing in front of him for 42 years. I know about Fallon, I said. The color left his face completely. We'll talk about that later, I said. Just the two of us. I picked up my fork. I finished my dinner. And the table stayed silent around me with the particular quality of silence that follows the moment when everyone in a room realizes at the same time that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. Marcus Webb sat back down. He picked up his fork. He looked at me once more with the expression of a man who had done the one thing he could do, and then he went back to his meal. Outside, the evening had gone fully dark. Damian Cole was from Biloxi, Mississippi. He used to say that like a joke. Biloxi, Mississippi, ma'am, which explains everything with a delivery so dry you could lose the punchline if you weren't paying attention. He was 26 when I first met him, lean and unhurried with the kind of stillness that either means someone is half asleep or completely switched on, and with Damien it was always the second thing. He had a daughter named Amara who was 4 years old, and who he kept a photo of tucked into the inner band of his helmet, folded so small you'd miss it if you didn't know to look. I knew to look. I made it my business to know what everyone on my team carried. Not the gear was my job, the manifests, and the weights and the load distribution across the hull in conditions that didn't forgive miscalculation. I mean what they carried that didn't show up on any inventory. The photograph, the lucky coin, the letter someone hadn't opened yet because opening it would mean acknowledging a reality they weren't ready for. You learn a team the way you learn a vessel, by knowing where the weight sits, where the stress concentrates, where the thing is most likely to fracture under pressure. We were 8 months into a rotation I can't name in a theater I won't specify, running insertion support for a joint operation that had been planned for 6 weeks and was coming apart by the third night in the way that plans do when they meet conditions that didn't exist on any map. The river was wrong. Not wrong in the way that intelligence gets things slightly wrong in the way that means someone somewhere had been working from information that was outdated or compromised or both. The current was stronger, the banks lower. And there was a structure on the eastern approach that wasn't on any of our imagery, which meant either it had been built recently or someone had decided we didn't need to know about it. I made the call to redirect. 200 meters south, different approach angle added 4 minutes to the window. 4 minutes in that context is a very long time, and the man in command of the insertion team, I will not use his name, let me know with precision and economy exactly what he thought of my decision. I didn't argue. I redirected. We got them in. We got them out. The mission closed. And in the debrief when the redirect was reviewed, and the alternative approach was modeled against what the eastern structure turned out to be a reinforced observation post with overlapping fields of fire, the 4 minutes I'd added became the 4 minutes that meant all 6 men came home instead of a different number. Nobody put it in those terms officially. That's not how it works. What happened was what happened, and the alternative was theoretical, and you don't write citations for the catastrophe that didn't occur. But Damien found me afterward in the narrow galley of the support vessel where I was running through the post-op inventory because the inventory needed to run and because I needed something concrete to do with my hands, and he stood in the doorway and he said, quiet as anything, "That was you tonight. The redirect. That was you." I told him I was just reading the river. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You always read it right, Chief. That's why they call you Anchor. Not because you hold us down, because you're the thing we come back to." I have thought about that sentence many times in the years since. In dark rooms in the middle of the night, in the specific hours when the mind goes looking for evidence that a life has been worth its cost. It has never failed to do what it does, which is to make me feel briefly and completely that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That was 2019. In 2021, Damien Cole was stateside. Rotation complete, reassigned to a support role at Naval Air Station Fallon while he transitioned toward a training position. Routine. Safe. The kind of assignment that's supposed to be the easy part, the recovery part, the part where nothing happens because enough has already happened. He was on a maintenance platform on the eastern side of a storage facility when the primary support bracket failed. The fall was 14 feet. He landed wrong. The rod in his left femur was titanium, and the surgery was successful, and the physical therapy took 11 months, and at the end of it he walked, which the doctors said was not guaranteed in the first 48 hours. He walked with a different gait than before. He wouldn't run again the way he used to. He was medically separated from service 8 months later, and he went back to Biloxi, and his daughter Amara was 7 years old by then. And he told me later that she didn't understand why her father moved differently now, but that she had started holding his hand when they walked, which she hadn't done before. I knew about the platform failure when it happened. I knew about the investigation that followed materials failure, substandard components a bracket rated for a load it had never actually been tested to hold. I knew the contracting chain had been flagged. I knew the review was ongoing. What I had not known until Patterson said Naval Air Station Fallon across a dinner table in my father's house was where the substandard bracket had come from. Washington Construction and Development. Subcontractor. 2021. I had sat with that information through the rest of the main course, and through Diane's careful attempts to reestablish the evening's original atmosphere, and through Tyler's silence and Gerald's fractured non-words, and I had kept my face exactly where I needed it to be, because that is a skill that does not turn off, and because some information needs to be held quietly before it can be used correctly. But here, now sitting in the guest room Diane had offered after the dinner dissolved into its own wreckage, and Gerald had asked me in a voice stripped of everything except need if I would please stay just tonight so they could talk in the morning. Here I was not keeping my face anywhere. Here I was just sitting on the edge of a bed in a room that smelled of fabric softener and careful neutrality, and I was thinking about a man named Damien Cole, who used to keep a photograph folded into his helmet band, and his daughter Amara, who held his hand now when they walked. I took out my phone. I had a number I hadn't dialed in 8 months. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was the same unhurried Biloxi flat dry as ever. "Chief," he said, like no time had passed, like time was a thing that happened to other people. "Hey, Dee," I said. "I need to tell you something, and then I need to ask you something." A pause. The specific pause of a man recalibrating. "That sounds like the beginning of a long night," he said. "Yeah," I said. "It does." Outside the window, my father's house was quiet. Inside it, somewhere down the hall, I could hear him still awake, moving slowly, the careful sounds of a man circling something he didn't know how to approach. I knew what I was going to have to do in the morning. I just needed one night to decide how. Morning came gray and quiet the way mornings do when a house has been through something the night before and hasn't fully processed it yet. I was up before anyone else. Old habit, the kind that gets installed at a cellular level and doesn't uninstall when the circumstances change. I made coffee in a kitchen I didn't know the layout of, opening the wrong cabinet twice before finding the mugs, and I stood at the window above the sink and watched the backyard come into pale focus, and I thought about what Damien had told me on the phone. He had talked for 40 minutes. I had listened, mostly asking questions at intervals, the kind of questions that aren't looking for new information so much as confirming the shape of information already held. By the end, I knew 3 things I hadn't known when I dialed. First, Damien had already been contacted by NCIS, informally 6 weeks ago. They were building a materials fraud case, and they needed a witness who could speak to both the platform failure and the chain of custody for the components. He had agreed to cooperate. He hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to pull me into something that might complicate my position. Second, the lead investigator on the case was an agent named Reyes. Damien said she was thorough, said she had been thorough for 2 years, which meant this hadn't started recently. This had been moving towards something for a long time, quietly and carefully, the way serious investigations do. Third, Craig Mercer had a separate set of books. That was the phrase Damien used, a separate set of books relaying what Reyes had told him. A parallel accounting structure that routed certain subcontracting payments through a shell entity that was nominally owned by a company registered in Nevada, but traced back through 2 layers of incorporation to Mercer personally. Washington Construction's name was on the federal contracts. Washington Construction's certifications had been used to obtain the work. But the components, the brackets, the fasteners, the load-bearing hardware on 3 separate naval installation projects had been sourced through Mercer's structure at reduced cost from suppliers who had not been vetted and in several cases had not been licensed. Gerald's signature was on the contracts. Gerald's company was the named entity. Gerald had not known about the shell structure. That last part was the part I had spent the night turning over. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Unhurried, heavy at the heel in the way of men who have aged into their own weight. Gerald came into the kitchen in a gray robe and stopped when he saw me, with the expression of a man who had hoped for a few more minutes before this began and understood he wasn't going to get them. "Coffee's on the left," I said. He crossed to the counter, poured a mug, stood on the other side of the kitchen island, and wrapped both hands around it the way you hold something when you need something to hold. We were quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird started and stopped. "I didn't know," he said, "about Fallon, about what the materials were used for. Craig handled the sourcing. He told me everything was compliant, vetted within spec. I signed what he put in front of me because he had handled the procurement side for 11 years, and I had never had a reason not to trust him." He paused. "That's not an excuse. I know it isn't. But I want you to know it's the truth." I looked at him. "I know it's the truth," I said. "That's not what I've been trying to figure out." He waited. "What I've been trying to figure out," I said, "is when you found out." The kitchen went very still. Gerald set his mug down on the counter. He did it carefully with the deliberateness of a man buying himself seconds, and I watched him do it, and I waited because I had learned in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher than this one that silence is a question and eventually people answer questions. "February," he said. "This year. 4 months ago, Mercer came to me in February," he said. "He said there was a review. He said it was routine, probably nothing but that I should be aware. He said the exposure, if it became an issue, was manageable. He said—" Gerald stopped, pressed his lips together. "He said the best outcome was if someone with federal relationships could contextualize the situation before it escalated." "And you called me in June," I said. "I spent 4 months trying to handle it without—" He stopped again. "Without involving me," I said. "Without involving you," he said, very quietly. I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. Outside the window, the yard was fully light now, pale and flat, and somewhere in the neighborhood a dog was barking at something with the committed energy of an animal that had found its purpose for the morning. "He was going to let you take it," I said. "Mercer. He was going to let the case land on Washington Construction on your signature on your name. The shell structure is his, but it ran through your certifications. Legally, you are exposed whether you knew about the sourcing or not because you signed the compliance documents." Gerald said nothing. "He came to you in February not to warn you," I said. "He came to you in February to start managing you, to position you as the person who went looking for help. So that if this went to prosecution, the narrative was already built. Gerald Washington aware of scrutiny attempting to leverage government contacts to obstruct. That's not a man trying to protect a partnership. That's a man building a firewall out of someone else's body." The color moved through Gerald's face in a complicated way. Not surprise exactly. More like the look of a man watching something he had halfway understood become fully visible and finding that full visibility was worse than the half-knowledge had been. "He's been your partner for 11 years, I said. "Yes." "And in 11 years, did he ever once put something in writing that would implicate him directly?" A long pause. "No," Gerald said. He liked to keep things verbal. Said it was more efficient." I nodded slowly. More efficient. The language of a man who understood the evidentiary value of absence. "I need you to understand something," I said. I set down my mug, and I looked at my father across the kitchen island in the gray morning light, and I spoke to him the way I had learned to speak to people in moments when clarity mattered more than comfort. "I am not going to call anyone on your behalf. I am not going to use my position to make this go away. Not because I don't have the access I do, but because the case the NCIS is building is the right case, and the person it needs to land on is Craig Mercer, and the way I can best help you is not to interfere with it." Gerald looked at me for a long moment. "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to introduce you to a woman named Reyes," I said. "And you're going to tell her everything. Every conversation with Mercer, every document you signed, every meeting, every phone call, every verbal instruction, all of it. You're going to cooperate fully and completely, and you're going to do it because it's the right thing and because it's the only thing that separates you from him in a courtroom." His hands were flat on the counter. He was looking at them. "It will cost you the company," I said. "Probably. I won't lie to you about that." He was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking up, he said something I had not expected. "I missed your commissioning," he said. "I had a golf trip." "I know," I said. "I've thought about that for years," he said. Not every day, but more than I've admitted to anyone. I think about what you must have looked like standing there in your uniform. I think about the fact that I don't know what you looked like because I wasn't there." The bird outside started again. Same pattern. 3 notes and a pause. I did not tell him it was fine. It was not fine. I did not tell him it didn't matter. It had mattered enormously, and it still did, and the particular cruelty of these moments is that saying so doesn't undo anything. "Do the right thing with Reyes," I said. "That's where we start." Agent Reyes drove a gray sedan and carried her coffee in a thermos she'd clearly owned for a long time based on the wear pattern on the lid. She arrived at the house at 9:15, which was 40 minutes after I'd sent the message, which told me she had been close by and ready, which told me she had known this moment was coming before I'd arranged it. She was 39, compact with the specific economy of movement that comes from years of doing a job where being noticed can compromise outcomes. She wore a plain navy jacket and no jewelry except small silver studs, and she shook Gerald's hand with a directness that didn't perform warmth and didn't need to. She looked at me once when she came through the door, a brief, calibrated look, and then she looked away and didn't look back, which was its own form of acknowledgement. We had spoken on the phone twice in the past 6 months about a separate matter that I am not able to describe. She knew who I was. She had always known who I was. She had not known until this morning that I was Gerald Washington's daughter. I watched that land on her face in a fraction of a second and then disappear. That's professionalism. Not the absence of reaction, but the containment of it. Diane was not present. I had told her quietly before Reyes arrived that this was not a conversation that required her participation, and that the best thing she could do for Gerald right now was not be in the room. She had looked at me with an expression that traveled through several stages, quickly resistance calculation, and then a kind of reluctant recognition that I was the person in this house who currently understood the terrain. She went upstairs. Tyler had left the night before. I had heard his car in the driveway sometime around 11, the particular sound of a young man who doesn't know what to do with information that doesn't resolve into a simple action item and so defaults to motion. I didn't blame him. It takes years to learn how to sit with things. Patterson was not invited. It was Gerald Reyes and me at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the windows, and the coffee going cold, and the careful procedural work of a man deciding to tell the truth beginning to take its shape. Gerald talked for 2 hours. I sat to the side and said almost nothing. This was not my confession to make or my story to guide. I had gotten him to the room and the room to the right person, and the rest was between him and his own accounting. Reyes asked questions with the precision of someone who had been building a map for a long time and was now filling in the final coordinates. She didn't push. She didn't need to. Gerald had made his decision before she arrived, and decision-made people don't require pressure. He told her about the shell structure. He told her about the verbal instructions and the absence of documentation and the 11 years of a partnership he had trusted without examining the architecture of. He told her about February, about Mercer's visit, about the specific language Mercer had used. Manageable exposure, contextualize the situation, the right relationships, and I watched Reyes write certain phrases down with a stillness that meant they were phrases she had been waiting to hear confirmed. Toward the end, Gerald said something that made Reyes pause. "There were 3 projects," he said. "Fallon was one, but Craig also handled procurement on the Camp Pendleton warehouse renovation and the Coronado facility upgrade. Same sourcing structure. Same suppliers." Reyes looked up from her notepad. "You're certain about Coronado? I signed the compliance documents in March 2022, Gerald said. "Craig brought them to me at the office. I remember because it was a Thursday and I had a site visit that afternoon, and I was distracted. I didn't read them the way I should have." Reyes wrote something down. Then she looked at me for the second time since she'd entered the room, and this time the look held for a moment before she returned to her notepad. Coronado. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. I knew that installation in a way that went beyond professional familiarity, and Reyes knew that I knew it, and neither of us said anything about it because this was Gerald's conversation, and there would be time for other conversations later. After Reyes left with a recording with Gerald's commitment to provide full written documentation with the understanding that a formal interview would be scheduled within the week, Gerald and I sat at the table in the quiet. He looked diminished. Not broken, but reduced to something more accurate than the man who had stood by the fireplace the night before with his amber glass and his rehearsed words. I found I didn't feel the satisfaction I might once have expected to feel watching him reckon with his own failures. I felt something older and more tired than satisfaction. "She's going to get him," I said. "Mercer. The shell structure, the sourcing records, the communications, she has enough. Your cooperation makes the case cleaner. He will try to put as much of this on you as he can when it moves forward." "I know," Gerald said. "You need a different lawyer," I said. "Not Patterson. Patterson has been working for you, but his relationship with Craig's side of the operation is going to become a conflict. You need someone with no connection to Mercer or the procurement history." "I'll handle that today," he said. I nodded. We were quiet again. "The man who was hurt," Gerald said finally. "At Fallon. Do you know him?" I looked at my father. "Yes," I said. He absorbed that. The specific weight of it, not the liability, not the legal exposure, but the actual human fact of it. A man he had never met. A platform built with components that hadn't been what they were supposed to be. A 14-foot fall and a titanium rod and a different gait and a daughter who held his hand now when they walked. "Is he?" Gerald started. "He's alive," I said. "He's home. He has a daughter who thinks he hung the moon, and he makes her breakfast on Sunday mornings, and he coaches her soccer team from the sideline because he can't run the way he used to, but he shows up every week without fail." I paused. He's one of the finest people I've ever worked alongside. And he will never do the thing he spent his career training to do, because a bracket that wasn't rated for its load gave way on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Gerald looked at the table. He looked at it for a long time. "I would like to write to him," he said quietly. If that would be appropriate. Not to ask anything. Not to explain anything. Just to acknowledge." I thought about Damian Cole, about the economy of his words, and the specific quality of his silences, and what he had said to me in a galley on a support vessel in a theater I cannot name. I thought about what he would do with a letter from the man whose company's components had changed his life. I thought he would read it. I thought he might write back. I thought he would decide for himself what it meant the way he decided everything slowly without drama from the inside out. "I'll ask him," I said. "The choice is his." Gerald nodded. His hands were flat on the table again, and I noticed for the first time that they were my hands, same width across the knuckles, same way of settling when the body was trying to hold something steady. I had never noticed that before. I had spent so many years not looking at him closely enough to notice. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, and the sound of it faded, and the house was quiet. 3 weeks later, Damian Cole drove 11 hours from Biloxi, Mississippi to a federal courthouse in Nevada, and he told the truth about a Tuesday afternoon in 2021 with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. I wasn't in the courtroom. I was in the hallway on a bench outside the double doors with a paper cup of vending machine coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes in, and I sat there the way I had learned to wait in 100 different places, not impatiently, not comfortably, just present, occupying the time without fighting it. The hearing was a preliminary proceeding, not a trial. Mercer's defense team was there. Mercer was there. I had passed him in the corridor without meaning to, and he had looked at me with the expression of a man who had just understood something too late, which was the first honest thing I had ever seen on his face. He was 63, prosperous-looking, with the groomed confidence of a man who had spent decades believing that problems were things that happened to other people's names. He looked smaller than I had expected. They usually do. Damian came out through the doors at 11:47. He walked the way he walked now, measured, deliberate, the slight adjustment at the left hip that you'd miss if you didn't know to look for it. He saw me on the bench, and he came over and he sat down beside me without ceremony, the way people sit down when they have known each other in conditions that make formality seem beside the point. We sat in silence for a moment. "How'd it go?" I said. "Said what I said," he said. "They wrote it down." I nodded. That was Damian. The minimum necessary words placed with maximum accuracy. "Reyes came out after," he said. "Said it was useful. Said my testimony on the Fallon platform, specifically the sequence of events, the component failure, the inspection records, was going to be difficult for the defense to work around." "Good," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father's attorney was in there?" "I know, the new one, not Patterson." "I know." Another pause. Damian turned his paper cup in his hands slowly, the way he turned things when he was deciding something. "He's cooperating clean," he said. "Reyes told me that too. Said he came in with everything, held nothing back, and that his account and the documentary evidence lined up without gaps." He paused. "That matters, in terms of how this resolves." "I know," I said again. He looked at me sideways. "You keep saying I know, because I do." "Yeah," he said. And then after a moment, he wrote me a letter. I had told Gerald that Damian would decide for himself. I had not asked Damian what he'd decided. It was not mine to manage. "I know," I said. Damian made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. It was a good letter," he said. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't explain too much. Just said he knew his name was on the paperwork, and that paperwork had consequences for a real person, and that he was sorry for that, and that he hoped I was okay. 3 paragraphs. No lawyers reviewed it. You could tell. "Did you write back?" "Not yet," he said. "Still figuring out what I want to say." He paused. "Amara asked me why I drove all this way. I told her I had to go tell the truth about something that happened to me so it wouldn't happen to someone else." She thought about that for a while, and then she said, "Okay, that makes sense. Can we get a dog when you get back?" I felt something ease slightly in my chest. "What did you say?" Said probably yes. We sat there in the courthouse hallway with our cold coffees and the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of a building doing its procedural work, and it was one of the most ordinary moments I had experienced in a long time, and I held on to it with both hands. 2 days later, back in the city, 4 of them came. I don't know how they found the time or coordinated the logistics. Operators are not known for their administrative efficiency outside of mission parameters, but they showed up at a bar 3 blocks from my apartment on a Wednesday evening, which is not a night anyone chooses for anything, which meant they had chosen it on purpose. Chief Petty Officer Dana Reinhold, who I had not seen in 14 months. Petty Officer First Class Jerome Vasquez, who I had served alongside on 4 deployments, and who owed me $11 from a bet made in 2018 that he has never acknowledged the outcome of. Senior Chief Marcus Tran, who said nothing when he arrived, except "You look tired, Chief," and then bought the first round. And Damian Cole, who had apparently driven 2 more hours after the courthouse, rather than going straight back to Biloxi, which he would never admit was for any reason other than logistical convenience. They filled the booth, and they ordered things, and they talked the way people talk who have been in conditions together that restructure the meaning of ordinary conversation. Not about Fallon, not about Mercer, not about courthouses or platforms or titanium rods, about Amara's potential dog, about Vasquez's new apartment that had a dishwasher for the first time in his adult life, which he described with a reverence usually reserved for more significant achievements. About a training evolution Reinhold had run the previous month that had gone sideways in a specific way that was only funny in retrospect and only to people who understood the specific parameters of sideways. I sat in the middle of it and said less than anyone else, which is how it usually was, and listened to the sound of it, the specific sound of people who had been through things together and were still here, still intact, still capable of sitting in a bar on a Wednesday night and arguing about whether Vasquez's dishwasher was actually a significant life achievement or merely a standard appliance. Marcus Tran looked at me at some point in the evening in a gap between conversations and said quietly without preamble, "Heard you went home." "I did," I said. "How was it?" I thought about a kitchen in the gray morning, a man with his hands flat on a counter and his voice stripped of everything but the truth, a letter written in 3 paragraphs with no lawyers reviewing it. A girl in Biloxi who held her father's hand when they walked. "Complicated," I said. He nodded. He didn't ask anything else because he understood the way people understand things when they have seen enough of the world to know that complicated is usually the most honest word available. Vasquez, overhearing, said, "Family's always complicated. That's not a bug, that's the operating system." Reinhold threw a bald napkin at him. Damian said that doesn't even make sense in his flat Biloxi delivery, and Vasquez said it made complete sense. And the argument about whether it made sense lasted 6 minutes and resolved nothing and was the best 6 minutes of my month. Outside the city moved the way it always does, indifferent and continuous, and full of people navigating their own complicated operating systems. And inside the bar on a Wednesday, the people I had chosen and who had chosen me back were loud and present and entirely stubbornly alive. I thought about Marcus Webb standing up at that dinner table. 2 words that had changed the temperature of a room. The specific courage of an old man who had decided in the middle of a meal he didn't owe anyone anything and that he was not going to sit quietly while something wrong continued to be wrong. I made a note to call him, not for any reason, just to say that it had mattered, that he had been seen doing the right thing, and the right thing had carried. And I was grateful. Some things need to be said out loud. I was learning slowly and unevenly that that was true. The formal charges against Craig Mercer were filed on a Thursday morning in late August, 7 weeks after Gerald sat at the kitchen table with Agent Reyes and began the long, costly work of telling the truth. I read the press release on my phone in a parking garage on my way to somewhere else, the way you receive news that you've been expecting, not with surprise, but with the specific relief of a thing that has been suspended finally landing where it was always going to land. Materials fraud, false certification on federal contracts, 3 naval installations, a financial structure designed to obscure accountability and concentrate profit at the top while distributing liability downward. It was all there in the careful, neutral language of federal filings, and between the lines of that language was 11 years of a man who had understood that systems could be navigated by people willing to treat other people's safety as an acceptable variable. Gerald's name was in the filing. It had to be. His signature was on the contracts, his company was the named entity, and the law does not make room for the full texture of how a thing happened, only for the documented record of what occurred. His attorney had negotiated a cooperation agreement that acknowledged his role in signing the compliance documents, while making clear the distinction between negligence and intent. It was not a clean outcome for him. It was not supposed to be. He called me that afternoon. I was surprised briefly that he called. Then I wasn't. He had been calling more in the week since the morning with Reyes. Not often, not with the overcorrecting frequency of a man trying to make up for lost time all at once, but steadily. A call on a Sunday. A message about something he'd read that made him think of a question he wanted to ask. Small, careful attempts at a frequency that had never existed between us and was being built now from scratch, the way you build things when the original construction was insufficient and you're working with what remains. "I saw the filing," he said. "I know," I said. "I want to say I know. This isn't I know saying thank you is insufficient." He paused. "But I don't have a better word." "You don't need to thank me," I said. "I didn't do this for you." A silence. Then quietly, "I know. That's part of what I'm trying to thank you for." I stood in the parking garage with the phone against my ear and the sound of a distant car somewhere on a lower level, and I thought about what it would have cost me to say nothing at that dinner. To absorb Tyler's carelessness and Diane's careful diminishments and my father's inadequate index card and go home and close the door and continue being the person who had decided at 15 that she did not need any of this. It would have cost nothing on the surface. I had been paying that particular price for so long that I had stopped registering it as a price. "The company," I said. "What's happening?" "Winding down," he said. "The federal contracts are voided. There's civil exposure from the installations. The remediation costs are significant. We're working through it. Some assets will be liquidated." A pause. It's a lot to process. 11 years of work, but it wasn't the way it was built, wasn't right at the end. I didn't build it wrong deliberately, but I built it carelessly. There's a difference, but both have consequences. That was the most self-aware thing I had ever heard Gerald Washington say. I didn't remark on it. I let it stand where he'd placed it. "Diane," I said. "She's adjusting." The weight of that word carried a full paragraph beneath it. "She's not happy. She's not going to be happy for a while. But she's staying." That surprised me a little. Another pause. "She asked about you after that dinner. She asked what you actually did." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know all of it," he said. "That I should have asked a long time ago, and I hadn't." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Well, maybe you should ask now." A beat. "So, I'm asking now, Sabrina, if you're willing." I looked at the concrete pillar in front of me. Gray and solid, and entirely without sentiment. I had spent a long time building my life around things that held without requiring anything in return. Concrete, structure, mission. The clean lines of a job that could be evaluated against objective criteria. I thought about what it would mean to answer. Not the operational details, those had their own rules and always would, but the shape of it. The texture of a life spent in conditions that most people never encounter, making decisions that most people never have to make, carrying things that don't have names in civilian language. Not all of it, I said. Not now, but yes, I'm willing. He let out a breath that had been held for a long time. Maybe since February when Mercer had come to him and the first cracks appeared. Maybe longer. Maybe since a hospital window in March 27 years ago when he had looked at something outside that I had never stopped wondering about. What were you looking at? I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. People always know when you ask the question they've been waiting their whole life to be asked. There was a tree, he said, outside the window, a big oak old, and I remember thinking your mother would have known the name of it. She knew every tree. She would have had some story about it, something she'd read, something she'd looked up. She would have told it to you and you would have remembered it forever, and I had nothing. His voice was even, but only just. I didn't know the name of the tree. I didn't know how to be the person who told you things like that. I looked at that tree and I thought, she's going to be so alone now, and I don't know how to fix that. And then I made every wrong decision possible about how to handle not knowing. The parking garage was very quiet. Her name was the tree on the calendar, I said. Her handwriting, green marker, the good stuff. Yes, he said. That's right. We were quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of two people with nothing to say. The other kind, the kind that means something has been set down that was heavy, and both people are standing in the space of having set it down, and neither is quite ready to move yet. I'm going to come to the house again, I said finally, in a few weeks, not for any reason, just to come. Okay, he said, and then I'll make sure I know the name of the oak out front. It was such a small thing to say, such a Gerald Washington thing to say, an action item, something concrete, a problem to be solved by gathering information. And it was also underneath its literalness, the most tender thing he had said to me in 42 years. I didn't tell him that. I let him have it without examination. Okay, I said. I drove home through the city in the late afternoon light through streets full of people navigating their ordinary Thursdays, and I thought about a 15-year-old girl who had made a quiet, permanent decision and lived inside it for 27 years. I thought about what it cost to unmake a decision like that. Not all at once, that's not how it works, not for anyone, not for any kind of damage that was laid down over years, slowly, unevenly, with long silences and awkward phone calls, and a man looking up the name of a tree because it is the one concrete thing he knows how to offer. It was not a restoration. You cannot restore what was not built correctly to begin with. But you can build something new on the same ground if both people are willing to show up for it. I was not sure yet how willing I was. I was sure I was more willing than I had been a month ago. That was enough to start. A year later, almost to the day, I drove the 40 minutes to my father's house on a Sunday afternoon in September. The oak out front was turning. Early autumn had come in overnight and caught the edges of the leaves, and the tree stood in the afternoon light with the particular beauty of something in the process of changing, not dying, not done. Just moving through the part of the cycle that requires letting go of what it had been. Gerald was on the porch when I pulled up. He had a mug of something and a paperback turned face down on the railing, which meant he had been reading and heard my car and put the book down, and I noticed that he had not put it away, just face down, saving his place, which meant he expected to return to it after. That small detail said more about the quality of the afternoon than anything he could have planned. You're early, he said. I left early, I said. He nodded as if that was a complete explanation, which it was. The house was quieter than it had been a year ago. Diane was at her sister's for the weekend. Tyler had moved into his own place in March. He and I had spoken twice since the dinner, briefly and carefully, two people who had not yet found the language for each other, but were no longer pretending the language wasn't needed. That was progress. Tyler's specific kind of progress, which looked like absence until you understood it, was actually approach. Gerald and I sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the oak move in the slight wind, and he told me its name. Quercus alba, white oak can live 400 years. The oldest documented specimen is over 500, and I could tell he had prepared this, researched. It carried it for the past year, waiting for the right moment to deliver it. I let him deliver it without comment, and he didn't comment on my not commenting, and that was its own form of fluency. We talked for 2 hours. Not about Mercer. His trial was scheduled for February. Cooperation agreement intact. Reyes's case had continued to strengthen, and the defense had already begun preliminary overtures toward a plea. Not about the company, which was gone now, fully wound down the name Washington Construction and Development, dissolved into the administrative record of things that no longer exist. We talked about the things people talk about when they are trying to learn each other from the middle of a life rather than from the beginning. His father, who he had also been estranged from, which I had not known. My first year in the Navy, which he had missed in real time, but could receive now in retrospect. A trip my mother had wanted to take to Portugal that they had kept postponing for practical reasons, and never taken, which he said without drama, and which I received the same way, because grief at this distance is not an emergency, it is a weather pattern, and you learn to be outside in it. Damien had gotten the dog. He had sent me a photograph, a large, deeply impractical golden retriever named Sargent, who, according to Damien, had immediately claimed the left side of the couch as sovereign territory, and showed no signs of negotiating. Amara had named him. Of course she had. He had written back to Gerald. A short letter, 2 paragraphs. I didn't read it. It wasn't mine to read, but Gerald had told me it existed, and that he kept it in the desk drawer in the study, and that he had read it more than once. He did not tell me what it said, and I did not ask. Some things belong entirely to the people who exchange them. Marcus Webb had called me the week after I'd called him. We had talked for an hour. He was 80 now and sharp as anything, living in a retirement community in Annapolis, where he had by his own account become the informal authority on naval history for anyone within conversational range who was willing to listen, which was most people, because Marcus had a way of making everything feel essential. He asked me to come visit. I said I would. I meant it. The afternoon light moved across the porch, and the oak turned in the wind, and Gerald told me about a documentary he'd watched about the Pacific Theater that he thought I would find technically interesting, and I told him he was probably right, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about naval logistics in 1944, I thought about the 40-minute drive I had almost not made the index card with 4 words, and no apology, the kitchen window, and the neighbor's dog with its oversized stick. And I thought about a word. Anchor. I have turned that word over in my mind so many times that I know it from every angle. Now the weight of it, the shape of it, the way it sits differently depending on the context you carry it into. In the operational context, an anchor is a fixed point, something the rest of the system orients around when conditions become disorienting. Not passive, an anchor works constantly, holding against the force of everything trying to pull the chain away from where it needs to be. It is unglamorous work. It does not surface. It does not receive the kind of recognition that gets written into citations or displayed on walls. It just holds and holds and holds, and the holding is the whole job. They didn't call me anchor because I weighed the team down. They called me anchor because when everything else was drifting, the plan, the mission, the men, I was the thing that held. You need an anchor most when the water gets rough. What I had not understood for most of my life was that the same thing that made me valuable in the water could function on land too. That the steadiness was not only a professional tool, that it could be brought to bear on a porch in September, on a 40-minute drive on a kitchen table at 7 in the morning, with a man who had made every wrong decision about how to handle not knowing. That holding did not only mean holding the line, sometimes it meant holding the door open. Being the fixed point that someone else could find their way back to, not because they deserved it, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but because you were capable of it. And capability in the direction of repair is not weakness. It is the other kind of courage. The kind that doesn't happen in water in darkness under fire. The kind that happens on an ordinary Sunday afternoon on a porch with cold coffee and a book left face down on a railing. If you're listening to this and you have been the one who held in your family, in your work, in the quiet places no one else saw, I want you to know that I understand what that costs. I understand the specific exhaustion of being the fixed point when everything else is drifting. I understand the decision to stop holding, and I understand why you made it, and I understand the question of whether it's possible to begin again. I don't have a clean answer for that. I only have what happened when I drove 40 minutes on a Tuesday evening with an index card in my pocket and walked through a door I had every reason to stay away from. Sometimes the water gets rough, and you discover that what you are at the bottom of everything is still an anchor, and sometimes that is enough. Drop your country in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me if any of this felt familiar. I read more than you think, and some nights knowing you're out there is the thing that holds.